Ranger's Apprentice, Book 2, The Burning Bridge, by John Flanagan. Chapter 32. The kingdom's main army advanced slowly across the littered battlefield. The crushing attacks by the cavalry on three sides had given them a decisive victory in the space of a few short minutes. In the second line of command party, Horace rode beside Sir Rodney. The battlemaster had selected Horace as his shield man, riding on his left side in recognition of his service to the kingdom. It was a rare honor for someone in his first battle, but Sir Rodney thought that the boy had more than deserved it. Horace viewed the battlefield with mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was vaguely disappointed that so far he had not been called upon to play a part. On the other, he felt a profound sense of relief. The reality of battle was far removed from the glamorous dreams he had entertained as a boy. He had pictured a battle like this as a series of carefully coordinated, almost choreographed actions involving skillful warriors performing brave acts of chivalry. Needless to say, in those dreams, the most prominent and chivalrous warrior in the field had been Horace himself. Instead, he had watched in horror the stabbing, hacking, shoving brawl of blood and dust and screams that had developed before him. Men, war girls, and horses had all died, and their bodies sprawled now in the dust of the plains of Uthal, like so many scattered ragdolls. It had been fast and violent and confused, but now as they rode forward, details began to emerge, and he was horrified as he saw the red surcoats of battle school apprentices among the dead. He saw one body limp and lifeless as the stretcher bearers turned it over, and beneath the blood and dirt that smeared the pale face, he recognized Paul, a year 4 apprentice, who had been an assistant sword drill instructor over the past months. As Horace's natural skill with the sword had become evident, he and the older boy had become casual friends. When Horace was hurriedly packing his trip for the Celtica, Paul had come to the barracks to lend him a warm cloak and a pair of strong boots. Now he was dead, and the debt would never be repaid. Horace felt a sense of emptiness and loss. He glanced now at Sir Rodney. The battlemaster's grim face told him that it was always this way. Horace's throat was dry, and he tried to ease it by swallowing. He felt a sudden stab of doubt. He wondered, if he were called upon to fight, whether he would simply freeze in fear. For the first time in his life, it had been driven home to him that people actually died in battles, and this time he could be one of those people. He tried to swallow again. This attempt was no more successful than the last. Morgarath and his remaining soldiers were in a defensive formation at the base of the cliffs. The soft marshy ground held the cavalry back, and there was no option but to take the infantry forward and finish the job in a bloody hand-to-hand fighting. Any normal enemy commander would have seen the inevitable result by now and surrendered to spare the lives of his remaining troops. But this was Morgarath, and he knew there would be no negotiating. They steeled themselves for the ugly task ahead of them. It would be a bloody and senseless fight, but there would be no alternative. Once and for all, Morgarath's power must be broken. Nevertheless, said Duncan grimly, as his front rank stopped a bare 100 meters from the Wargul's defensive half-circle, we'll give him a chance to surrender. He drew breath, about to order his trumpeter to sound the signal for a parley, when there was a movement at the front ranks of the Wargul army. "Sir," said Gillen suddenly, "they have a flag of truce." The kingdom's leaders looked in surprise as a white flag was unfurled, carried by a Wargul foot soldier. He stepped forward into the clear ground. From deep within the Wargul ranks came a horn signal, 5 ascending notes, the universal signal that requested a parley. King Duncan made a small gesture of surprise, hesitated, then signaled to his own trumpeter. "I suppose we better hear what he has to say," he said. "Give the reply." The trumpeter moistened his lips and blew the acceptance in reply, a descending sequence of 4 notes. "It'll be some kind of trick," said Halt grimly. When the cavalry had swept through the Araluen army to attack the Warguls, he had resumed his place at the command center. Now he frowned at the enemy's last move. Morgarath will send a herald to talk while he's making his escape. His voice trailed off as the Wargul ranks parted once more, and a figure rode forward, immensely tall and thin, clad in black armor and a bleaked black helmet. It was unmistakably Morgarath himself. Halt's right hand went instinctively to the quiver slung at his back, and within a second a heavy armor-piercing arrow was laid on his bowstring. King Duncan saw the movement. "Halt," he said sharply. "I've agreed to a truce. You will not cause me to break my word, even to Morgarath." The trumpet signal was a pledge of safety, and Halt reluctantly returned the arrow to his quiver. Duncan made quick eye contact with Baron Arald, signaling him to keep a close eye on the ranger. Halt shrugged. If he chose to put an arrow into Morgarath's heart, neither Baron Arald nor anyone else would be quick enough to stop him. Slowly, the Volturian figure on the white horse paced forward, his wargul standard bearer before him. A low murmur rose among the kingdom's army as men saw, for the first time, the man who for the past 15 years had been a constant threat to their lives and well-being. Morgarath stopped a mere 30 meters from their rank. He could see the royal party where they had moved forward to meet him. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the small figure hunched in a grey cloak and a shaggy ponent. "Duncan," he called, his thin voice carrying through the sudden silence, "I claim my rights." "You have no rights, Morgarath," the king replied. "You're a rebel and a traitor and a murderer. Surrender now, and your men will be spared. That's the only right I will grant you." "I claim the right of trial by single combat," Morgarath shouted back, ignoring the king's words. Then he continued contemptuously, "Are you too coward to accept the challenge, Duncan? Will you let thousands more of your men die while you hide behind them? Or will you let fate decide the issue here?" For a moment, Duncan was caught off guard. Morgarath waited, smiling quietly to himself. He could guess at the thoughts running through the minds of the king and his advisors. He had offered them a course of action that might spare the lives of thousands of their soldiers. Errol moved his horse alongside the king's and said angrily, "He has no claim to a knight's privileges. He deserves hanging, nothing more." Some of the others muttered in agreement. "And yet," said Halt quietly, and they all turned to look at him, "this could solve the problem facing us. The Wargals are mind-bound to Morgarath's will. Now that we can't use cavalry, they'll continue to fight as long as he wills them to, and they'll kill thousands of our men in the process. But if Morgarath were killed in single combat," Tyler interrupted, finishing the thought, "the Wargals would be without direction. Chances are they would simply stop fighting." Duncan frowned uncertainly. "We don't know that," he began. Sir David of Carey interrupted. "Surely, sir, it's worth a try. Morgarath has outsmarted himself here, I think. He knows we can't resist the chance to end this on a single combat. He's thrown the dice today and lost, but he obviously plans to challenge you, to kill you as a final act of revenge." "What's your point?" Duncan asked. "As Royal Battlemaster, I can respond to any challenge made to you, my lord." There was a brief murmur at this. Morgarath might be a dangerous opponent, but Sir David was the foremost tournament knight of the kingdom. Like his son, he had trained with the fabled swordmaster MacNeil, and his skill in single combat was legendary. He continued eagerly, "Morgarath is using the ruse of knighthood to gain a chance to kill you, sir. Obviously, he overlooked the fact that as king, you could be represented by a champion. Give him the right to challenge, and then let me accept." Duncan considered the idea. He looked to his advisors and saw grudging agreement. Abruptly, he made up his mind. "All right," he said finally. "I'll accept his right to challenge, but nobody says anything in acceptance. Only me. Is that clear?" His council nodded agreement. Duncan stood in his stirrups and called to the ominous black figure. "Morgarath," Duncan called, "although we believe you have forfeited any rights you may have as a knight, go ahead and make your challenge. As you say, let fate decide the issue." Now Morgarath allowed the smile to creep over his entire face, no longer trying to conceal it from those who watched him. He felt a quick surge of triumph in his chest, then a cold wash of hatred swept over him as he looked directly at the small, insignificant-looking figure behind the king. "Then as my right, before God," he said carefully, making sure he used the exact ancient words of the challenge, "and before all here present, I do so make my challenge to prove my cause is right and just, to..." He couldn't help hesitating and savoring the moment for a second. "Halt, The Ranger. There was a stunned silence. Then as Halt urged Abelard forward to accept the challenge, Duncan's penetrating cry of "No!" stopped him. His eyes glittered fiercely. "I'll take my chance, my lord," he said grimly. But Duncan threw out an arm to stop him from moving forward. "Halt is not a knight. You cannot challenge him," he called urgently. Morgarath shrugged. "Actually, Duncan, I can challenge anyone, and anyone can challenge me. As a knight, I don't have to accept any challenge, unless it is issued by another knight. But I can choose to do so, and I can choose whom I challenge." "Halt is forbidden to accept," Duncan said angrily. Morgarath laughed thinly. "Still slinking, hiding then, Halt," he sneered. "Like all rangers. Did I mention that we have one of your ranger brats as prisoner? So small we nearly threw him back, but I decided to keep him for torture instead. That will make one less sneaking, hiding spy in the future." Halt felt the blood draining from his face. There was only one person Morgarath could be talking about. There was an ominous calm to his voice as he spoke. "Turn him loose now, Morgarath, and I'll let you die quickly. Otherwise..." He let the threat hang unspoken, but Morgarath saw the pale face and recognized the barely restrained anger in his old enemy. Obviously, the ranger brat meant something to Halt. Then instinctively he recognized the truth. The boy was Halt's own apprentice. "You really should have taken better care of your whelp, Halt," he said casually. "After I've finished with you, I'll see to him personally." Halt felt a red surge of rage and hatred for the vulture-like figure before him. Hands reached out to stop him, but he shoved his horse forward facing Morgarath. "Then let's get to it, Morgarath. Halt! I command you to stop!" Duncan shouted, drowning him out. But then all eyes were drawn to a sudden movement from the second rank of the army. A mounted figure burst clear, covering short distance to Morgarath in a heartbeat. The Lord of Rain and Night reached for his sword, then realized the newcomer's own weapon was sheathed. Instead, his right arm drew back, and he hurled his gauntlet into Morgarath's thin face. "Morgarath!" he yelled, his young voice cracking. "I challenge you to single combat!" Then, wheeling his horse a few paces away, Horace waited for Morgarath's reply. Chapter 33. Will and Evanlyn never learned what it was that caused the wave of uncertainty in the Wargals who surrounded their small group. They had no way of knowing that it had happened at the moment when Morgarath realized he had been tricked into exposing his army to Duncan's cavalry. The two captives and the 4 Scandians all noticed the sudden uneasiness and hesitancy in the 20 or so Wargal warriors who had been left to guard them. Eric glanced quickly at his men, sensing an opportunity. So far they had not been disarmed. The odds of 4 against 20 were too much, even for Scandians, and the Wargals had only been told to detain them, not disarm them. "Something's happening," the Scandian Jarl muttered. "Stay ready, everyone." Unobtrusively, the small party made sure their weapons were free and ready for action. Then the moment of uncertainty turned to real, palpable fear among the Wargals. Morgarath had just signaled a general retreat, and those at the rear didn't distinguish themselves from the frontline troops for whom the order was intended. Over half of the Wargals guarding them simply ran. One sergeant, however, retained a vestige of independent thought as he growled a warning to his section. 8 in total. As their companions struggled and fought to make their way into the jam-packed entrance to freeze their pass, the remaining 8 black-clad troops held their position. But they were distracted and nervous, and Eric decided that the opportunity wouldn't get any better than this. "Now, lads," he yelled and swept his double-headed axe in a low horizontal arc at the sergeant. The Wargal tried to bring his iron spear up in defense, but he was a fraction too slow. The heavy axe sheared through his armor, and he went down. As Eric sought another opponent, his event fell on the rest of the Wargal troop. They chose the moment when another mine command went out from Morgarath for his men to withdraw and form a defensive position. The confusing orders in their minds made them easy targets for the Scandians, and they fell in short order. The others around them, intent on escaping to freeze their pass, took no notice of the brief and bloody skirmish. Eric looked around him with satisfaction, wiping his axe blade clean in a cloth he'd taken from one of the dead Wargals. "That's better," he said heartily. I've been wanting to do that for 4 days. But the walkers hadn't let their group unscathed. As he spoke, Nordal staggered and sank slowly to one knee. Bright blood stained the corners of his mouth, and he looked hopelessly at his leader. Erog moved to his side and dropped to his knees. "Nordal!" he cried. "Why are you wounded?" But Nordal could barely talk. He was grasping his right side, where the sheepskin vest was already heavily stained with his blood. The heavy sword he favored as a weapon had fallen from his grip. His eyes wide with fear, he tried to reach it, but it was beyond his grasp. Quickly, Horace scooped up the weapon and put it in his hand. Nordal nodded his fangs and slowly let himself drop to a sitting position. The fear was gone from his eyes now. Will knew that Scandians believed a man must die with his weapon in hand, if his soul were not to wander in torment for eternity. Now that he had his sword firmly in the grasp, Nordal was not afraid to die. Weakly he waved them away. "Go," he said, finally finding his voice. "I'm finished. Get to the ships." Eric nodded quickly. "He's right," he said, straightening from beside his friend. "There's nothing we can do for him." The others nodded, and Eric grabbed first Will and then Evanlyn and shoved them along him in front of him. "Come on, you two," he said roughly. "Unless you want to stay here till Morgarath gets back." And moving together, in a tight little group, the 5 of them shoved their way through the milling crowd of walkers, all trying to move in the opposite direction. Morgarath was stung by the impact of the heavy leather glove on his face. Furious, he turned to stare at the challenger, who had ruined his plan. Then he allowed that thin smile to spread over his face once more. His challenger was no more than a boy, he realized. Big, certainly, and muscular, but the fresh face under the simple conical helmet couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Before the startled member of the King's Council could react, he replied swiftly, "I accept the challenge." He was a second ahead of Duncan's furious cry, "No, I forbid it!" Realizing he was too late, he sought desperately for a way to prevent this one-sided contest. He forced himself to laugh scornfully at the black-clad figure. "Really, Morgarath? Is this your knightly challenge? You want to fight an apprentice, a mere boy? I've always known you as a treacherous swine, but at least I never doubted your courage. Now I see you turned a coward as well as a traitor." Morgarath smiled sardonically at the king before he answered. "Is that the best you can do, Duncan?" he asked. "Do you really think I'll fall for such a transparent ploy? Do you believe I care what you or your toadies think of me? I'll fight the boy, and I'll do it gladly. As you know, once a challenge is given and accepted, there can be no withdrawal." He was right, of course. The strict rules of chivalry and knighthood, by which they had all sworn solemn oath to be bound by, did decree just that. Morgarath smiled now at the boy beside him. He would make short work of him, and the boy's quick death would serve to infuriate Halt even more. Halt, meanwhile, watched the Lord of Rain and Night through slitted eyes. "Morgarath, you're already a dead man," he muttered. Halt felt a firm hand on his arm, and he turned to look into Sir David's grim eyes. The battlemaster had his sword drawn and resting over his right shoulder. "The boy will have to take his chances, Halt," he said. "What chances? He has no chance," Halt replied. Sir David acknowledged the fact sadly. "Be that as it may, you can't interfere in this combat, or stop you if I even think you're going to try. Don't make me do that. We've been friends far too long." He held Halt's angry gaze for a few seconds, then the ranger agreed bitterly. He knew the knight wasn't bluffing. The code of chivalry meant everything to him. The byplay hadn't been lost on Morgarath. He was confident that the moment the boy fell, Halt would accept his original challenge, king's order or no king's orders. And then at least, Morgarath would know the satisfaction of killing his old hated enemy before his own world came crashing down around him. He turned now to Horace. "What weapons, boy?" he said in an insulting tone. "How do you choose to fight?" Horace's face was white and strained with fear. For a moment his voice was trapped inside his throat. He wasn't sure what had come over him when he galloped forward and issued the challenge. It certainly wasn't something he'd planned. A red rage had overtaken him. and he had found himself out here in front of the entire army, throwing his gauntlet into Morgarath's startled face. Then he thought of Morgarath's threat to Will, and how he had been forced to leave his friend at the bridge, and he managed at least to speak. "As we are," he said. Both of them carried swords. In addition, Morgarath's long kite-shaped shield hung at his saddle, and Horace carried his round buckler slung on his back. But Morgarath's sword was a two-handed broadsword, nearly a foot longer than the standard cavalry sword Horace carried. Morgarath turned now to call once more to Duncan. "The whelp chooses to fight as we are. You stand by the rules of conduct, I assume, Duncan," he said. "You'll find unmolested," Duncan agreed in a bitter tone. Those were the rules of single combat. Morgarath nodded and made a mocking bow in the king's direction. "Just be sure that murderous stranger Halt understands that," he said, continuing his plan of driving Halt to a cold fury. "I know he has little knowledge of the rules of knighthood and chivalry." "Morgarath," said Duncan coldly, "don't try to pretend that what you're saying has any connection with real chivalry. I ask one more time, spare the boy's life." Morgarath feigned a surprised expression. "Spare him, your majesty? He's a lump of a boy, big for his age. Who knows, you might be better served asking him to spare me." "If you must persist with murder, that's your choice, Morgarath. But save us your sarcasm," said Duncan. Again, Morgarath made that mocking bow. Then he said casually over his shoulder to Horace, "Are you ready, boy?" Horace swallowed once, then nodded. "Yes," he said. It was Gillen who saw what was coming and managed to shout a warning just in time. The huge broadsword had snaked out of its scabbard with incredible speed, and Morgarath swung it backhanded at the boy beside him. Warned by the shout, Horace rolled to one side, the blade hissing inches above his head. In the same movement, Morgarath had set spurs to his dead white horse and was galloping away, reaching for his shield and settling it on his left arm. His mocking laughter carried back to Horace as the boy recovered. "Then let's get started," he laughed, and Horace felt the throat go dry as he realized he was now fighting for his life. Chapter 34. Morgarath was wheeling his horse in a wide circle to gain room. Horace knew that he'd swing around soon and charge down on him, using the momentum of his charge as much as the force of his sword to try to strike him from the saddle. Guiding his horse with his knees, he swung away in the opposite direction, shrugging his buckler around from where it hung on his back and slipping his left arm through the straps. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Morgarath, 80 meters away, spurring his horse forward in a charge. Horace clapped his heels into his own horse's ribs and swung him back to face the black-clad figure. The two sets of hoof beasts overlapped, merged, then overlapped once more as the riders thundered towards each other. Knowing his opponent had the advantage of reach, Horace determined to let him strike the first blow, then attempt a counter-strike as they passed. They were nearly on each other now, and Morgarath suddenly rose in his stirrups, and from his full height swung an overhand blow at the boy. Horace, expecting the move, threw up his shield. The power behind Morgarath's blow was devastating. The sword had Morgarath's immense height, the strength of his arm, and the momentum of his galloping horse behind it. Timing it to perfection, he had channeled all those separate forces and focused them into his sword as it cleaved down. Horace had never in his life felt such a destructive force. Those watching winced at the ringing crash of sword on shield, and they saw Horace sway under the mighty stroke, almost knocked clean from his saddle in the first pass. All thought of a counter-strike was gone now. It was all he could do to regain his saddle, as his horse skittered away, dancing sideways, as Morgarath's mount, trained for battle, lashed out with its rear hooves. Horace's left arm, his shield arm, was rendered completely numb by the terrible force of the blow. He shrugged it repeatedly as he rode away, moving the arm in small circles to try to regain some feeling. Finally, he felt a dull ache there that seemed to stretch the entire length of his limb. Now he knew real fear. All his training, all his practice, was nothing compared to Morgarath's years and years of experience. He wheeled to face Morgarath and rode in again. On the first pass, they met shield to shield. This time, he saw his opponent was angling to pass on his right side, his sword arm side, and he realized that the next shattering blow would not land on his shield. He would have to parry it with his own sword. His mouth was dry as he galloped forward, trying desperately to remember what Gillen had taught him. But Gillen had never prepared him to face such an overpowering strength. He knew he couldn't take the risk of gripping his sword lightly and tightening at the moment of impact. His knuckles widened on the hilt of the sword, and suddenly Morgarath was upon him, and a massive broadsword swung in a glittering arc over his head. Horace threw up his own sword to parry, just in time. A mighty crash and slithering scream of steel on steel set the watcher's nerves jangling. Again, Horace reeled in the saddle from the force of the blow. His right arm was numb from fingertip to elbow. He knew that he would have to find a way to avoid Morgarath's near-paralyzing blows, but he couldn't think how. He heard hoofbeats close behind, and turning, realizing that this time Morgarath hadn't gone to gain ground for another charge. Instead, he had wheeled his horse almost immediately, sacrificing the extra force gained in charge for the sake of the fast follow-up attack. The broadsword swung back again. Horace reared his horse onto its hind legs, spinning it in place and taking Morgarath's sword on his shield once more. This time the force behind it was a little less devastating, but not by much. Horace cut twice at the Black Lord, forehand and backhand. His smaller, lighter sword was faster to wield than the mighty broadsword, but his right arm was still numb from the parry, and his strokes had little power behind them. Morgarath deflected them easily, almost contemptuously, with his shield, then cut again at Horace overhand this time, standing in his stirrup for extra purchase. Once again, Horace's shield took the force of the sword stroke. The circular piece of steel was bent almost double by the two massive strokes it had taken. Much more of this, and it would be virtually useless to him. He spurred his horse away from Morgarath, scrambling to remain mounted. His breath now came in rapid grasps, and sweat covered his face. It was as much the sweat of fear as exertion. He shook his head desperately to clear his vision. Morgarath was riding in again. Horace changed his direction at the last moment, dragging his horse's head to the left, taking him across the path of Morgarath's charging horse as he tried to evade the huge sword. Morgarath saw it coming and changed to a backhand stroke, crashing it into the rim of Horace's shield. The broadsword bit deep into the steel of the shield, then caught there. Seizing the moment, Horace stood in his stirrups and cut overhand at Morgarath. The black shield came up just a fraction too late, and Horace's blow glanced off the black-beaked helmet. He felt the shock of it up his arm, but this time the jarring felt good. He cut again as Morgarath wrenched and heaved to remove his sword. This time Morgarath caught the blow on his shield, but for the first time Horace managed to put some authority behind the stroke, and the Lord of Rain and Night grunted as he was rocked in his saddle. His shield dropped fractionally. Now Horace used the shorter blade of his sword to lunge at the gap that had opened between shield and body, and drove the point up at Morgarath's ribs. For a moment those watching felt a brief flare of hope, but the black armor held against the thrust, which was delivered from a cramped position and had little force behind it. Nonetheless, it hurt Morgarath, cracking a rib behind the mail armor, and he cursed in pain and jerked at his own sword once more. And then, disaster! Weakened by the crushing blows of Morgarath's that struck at it, Horace's shield simply gave way. The huge sword tore free at last. As it went, it ripped loose the leather straps that held the shield on Horace's arm. The battered, misshapen shield came free and spun away into the air. Horace reeled in the saddle again, desperately trying to retain his balance. Too close to use the full length of his blade, Morgarath slammed the double-handed hilt of the sword into the side of the boy's helmet, and the onlooker groaned in dismay as Horace fell from his saddle. His foot caught in the stirrups, and he was dragged for 20 meters or so behind his terrified galloping horse. Oddly enough, that fact probably saved his life as he was carried clear of the murderous reach of Morgarath's broadsword. Finally managing to kick himself free, he rolled in the dust, his sword still grasped in his right hand. Staggering, he regained his feet, his eyes full of sweat and dust. Dimly, he saw Morgarath bearing down on him again. Gripping his sword with both hands, he blocked the downward cut at the huge sword, but was beaten to his knees by the force of it. A flailing rear hoof took him in the ribs, and he went down in the dust again, as Morgarath galloped clear. A hush had fallen over the watchers. The walkers were unmoved by the spectacle, but the kingdom's army watched the one-sided contest in silent horror. The end was inevitable, they all knew it. Slowly, painfully, Horace climbed to his feet once more. Morgarath wheeled his horse and set himself for another charge. Horace watched him coming, knowing that this contest could have only one possible result. A desperate idea was forming in his mind as the dead white battle horse thundered towards him, heading to his right, leaving Morgarath room to strike down with his sword. Horace had no idea whether or not his armor would protect him from what he had in mind. He could be killed. And dully he laughed at himself. He was going to be killed anyway. He tensed himself ready. The horse was almost upon him now, swerving away to his right to leave Morgarath's striking room. In the last few meters, Horace hurled himself to the right after it, deliberately throwing himself under the horse's front hooves. Unprepared for his suicidal action, the horse tried desperately to avoid him. Its foreleg crossed and it stumbled, then somersaulted in a tangle of legs and body into the dust. A great, wordless cry went up from the onlookers, as for a moment the scene was obscured by a cloud of roiling dust. Horace felt a hoof strike him in the back between the shoulder blades, then saw a brief red flash as another slammed into his helmet, breaking the strap and knocking it from his head. And he was hit more times than he could count, and the world was a blur of pain and dust, and most of all, noise. As his horse went down, Morgarath somehow kicked his feet out of the stirrups and fell clear. He crashed heavily to the ground, the broadsword falling from his grasp. Screaming in rage and fear, the white horse struggled to its feet again. It kicked one more time at the prone figure that had brought it down, then trotted away. Horace grunted with pain and tried to stand. He came to his knees, and vaguely he heard the swelling cheers of the watching army. Then the cheers gradually died, as the still, black-clad figure a few meters away began to move. Morgarath was winded, nothing more. He dragged in a vast lungful of air and stood. He looked around, saw the broadsword laying half buried in the dust, and moved to retrieve it. Horace's heart sank as the tall figure outlined now against the low afternoon sun. Desperately, Horace retrieved his own sword and scrambled to his feet. There was hardly an inch of his body that wasn't throbbing with pain. Groggy and trying to focus, he saw that Morgarath had discarded his triangular shield. Now holding the broadsword in a two-handed grip, he advanced. Again came the nerve-jangling squeeze and clash of steel. Morgarath rained blow after blow down on Horace's sword. Desperately, the apprentice warrior parried and blocked, but with each massive blow, his arms were losing their strength. He began to back away, but still Morgarath came on beating down on Horace's defenses with blow after shattering blow. And then, as Horace allowed the point of his sword to drop, unable to find the strength to keep it up anymore, Morgarath's huge broadsword whistled down one last time, smashing into the smaller sword, and snapped the blade in two. He stepped back now, a cruel smile on his face as Horace stared downly at the shorn-off blade in his right hand. "I think we're finished now," Morgarath said in a soft, toneless voice. Horace still looked at the useless sword. Almost unconsciously, his left hand reached for his dagger and slid it from its sheath. Morgarath saw the movement and laughed. "I don't think that will do you much good." Then, deliberately, he took the great broadsword up and back for a final, mighty overhand blow that would cleave Horace to the waist. It was Gillan who realized what was going to happen a second before it did. The broadsword began its downward arc, splitting the air, And now Horace, throwing everything into one final effort, stepped forward. Crossing the blades, he held a dagger supporting the shortened sword. The blocked blades took the impact of Morgarath's mighty stroke, but Horace had stepped close to the taller man, and so reduced the leverage of the long blade and the force of the blow. Morgarath's song clunged into the X formed by the two blades. Horace's knees buckled, then held, and for a moment Morgarath and he stood locked chest to chest. Horace could see the puzzled fury in the madman's face. Then the fury turned to surprise, and Morgarath felt a deep, burning agony pour through his body as Horace slipped the dagger free, and with every ounce of his strength behind it, drove it through Morgarath's chainmail and up into his heart. Slowly, the Lord of Rain and Night sagged and crumbled to the ground. Stunned silence gripped the onlookers for a good 10 seconds. Then, the cheering started. Chapter 35. What had a few minutes before been a battlefield now became a confusion. The Morgul army, released in an instant from Morgarath's mind control, now milled mindlessly about, waiting for some force to tell them what to do next. All sense of aggression had left them. Most of them simply dropped their weapons and wandered off. Others sat down and sang quietly to themselves. Without Morgarath's direction, they were like little children. The group, struggling to escape our 3-step pass, now stood mute and unmoving, waiting patiently for those at the front to clear the way. Duncan surveyed the scene in bewilderment. "We'll need an army of sheepdogs to round up this lot," he said to Baron Erald, and his counselor smiled in reply. "Better that than what we faced, my lord," he said, and Duncan had to agree. The smaller inner circle of Morgarath's lieutenants were a different matter. Some had been captured, but others had fled into the wastelands of the fens. Crowley, the Ranger Corps commandant, shook his head as he realized that he and his men faced many long, hard days in the saddle after this. He would have to assign a Ranger task force to hunt down Morgarath's lieutenants and bring them back to face the king's justice. It was always this way, he thought wryly. While everyone else could sit back and relax, the Rangers' works continued, non-stop. Horace, bruised, battered, and bleeding, had been taken to the king's own tent for treatment. He was badly injured after his insane leap under the battle horse's hooves. There were several broken bones, and he was bleeding from one ear. But amazingly, none of the injuries were critical, and the king's own healer, who had examined him immediately, was confident that he would make a full recovery. Sir Rodney had hurried up to the litter as the bearers were preparing to carry the boy off the field. His mustache bristled with fury as he stood over his apprentice. "What the hell do you think you were doing?" he roared, and Horace winced. "Who told you to challenge Morgarath? You're nothing but an apprentice boy, and a damn disobedient one at that." Horace wondered if the shouting was going to continue for much longer. If it were, he could almost wish to be back at facing Morgarath. He was dazed and sick and dizzy, and Sir Rodney's angry red face swam in and out of focus in front of him. The battlemaster's words seemed to bounce from one side of his skull to the other and back again, and he wasn't sure why he was yelling so much. Maybe Morgarath was still alive, he thought. And as the thought struck him, he tried to get up. Instantly, Rodney's glare faded and his expression changed to one of concern. He gently stopped the wounded apprentice from rising. Then he reached down and gripped the boy's hand in a firm grasp. "Rest, boy. You've done good enough today. You've done well." Meanwhile, Halt showed his way through the harmless walkers. They gave way without any resistance or resentment as he searched desperately for Will. But there was no sign of the boy, nor of the king's daughter. Once that they heard Morgarath's taunt, the Aralens had realized that if Will was still alive, there was a chance that Cassandra, as Evanlyn was really called, might have survived as well. The fact that Morgarath hadn't mentioned her indicated that her identity had remained a secret. This, of course, Halt realized, was why she had assumed her maid's name. By doing so, she prevented Morgarath's knowing what a potential lever he had in his hands. He pushed impatiently through another group of silent walkers, then stopped as he heard a weak cry from one side. A Scandian, barely alive, was sitting leaning against the bole of a tree. He had slumped down, his legs stretched straight in front of him in the dust, his head lolling weakly to one side. A huge stain of blood marked the side of his sheepskin vest. A heavy sword lay beside him, his hand too weak to hold it any longer. He made a feeble, scrabbling gesture towards it, and his eye beseeched Halt to help him. Nordal was growing weaker by the moment. He had allowed his grasp on the sword to release. Now weak and almost blinded, he couldn't find it, and here he was close to death. Halt knelt beside him. He could see there was no potential danger in the man. He was too far gone for any treachery. He took the sword and placed it in the man's lap, putting his hand on the leather-bound hilt. "Thanks, friend," Nordal grasped weakly. Halt nodded sadly. He admired the Scandians as warriors, and it bothered him to see one laid as low as this, so weak that he couldn't maintain his grip on his sword. The ranger knew what that meant to the sea raiders. He rose slowly and began to turn away, then stopped. Horace had said that Will and Evanlyn had been taken by a small party of Scandians. Maybe this man knew something. He dropped to one knee again and put his hand on the man's face, turning it towards him. "The boy," he said urgently, knowing he had only a few minutes. "Where is he?" Nordal frowned. The word struck a chord in his memory, but everything that had ever happened to him seemed a long time ago, and somehow unimportant. "Boy?" he repeated thickly, and Halt couldn't help himself. He shook the dying man. "Will," he said, his face only a few centimeters from the others. "A ranger, a boy, where is he?" A small light of understanding and memory burned in Nordal's eyes now as he recalled the boy. He'd admired his courage, he remembered, admired the way the boy had stood them off at the bridge. Without realizing it, he actually said the last 3 words. "At the bridge," he whispered, and Halt shook him again. "Yes, the boy at the bridge. Where is he?" Nordal looked up at him. There was something he had to remember. He knew it was important to his grim-faced stranger, and he wanted to help. After all, the stranger had helped him find his sword again. He remembered what it was. "Gone," he managed finally. He wished the stranger wouldn't shake him. It caused him no pain at all, because he couldn't feel anything. But it kept waking him from the warm, soft sleep he was drifting into. The bearded face was a long way from him now, at the end of the tunnel. The voice echoed down the tunnel. "Gone where?" He listened to the echo. He liked the echo. It reminded him of something from his childhood. Where? The echo came again, and now he remembered. The fence. Through the fence. To the ships. He smiled when he said it. He'd wanted to help the stranger, and he had. And this time, when the warm softness crept over him, the stranger didn't shake him. He was glad about that. Halt stood up from the body of Nordal. "Thank you, friend," he said simply. Then he ran to where he'd left Abelard gazing quietly and vaulted into the saddle. The fence were a tangle of head-high grasses, swamps, and winding passages of clear water. To most people, they were impassable, and an incautious step could lead to a person sinking quickly into the oozing mire of quicksand that lurched on every side. Once in the featureless marshes, it was easy to become hopeless lost and to wander until exhaustion, or until the venomous water snakes that thrived here found you unaware. Wise people avoided the fence. Only 2 groups knew the secret path through them, the Rangers and the Scandians, who had been raiding along the coastline for as long as Halt could remember. Sure-footed as ranger horses were, once Halt was truly into the tangle of tall grass and swampland, he dismounted and led Abelard. The signs of the safe paths were minute and easy to miss, and he needed to be close to the ground to follow them. He hadn't been traveling long when he began to see signs that a party had come before him, and his spirit lifted. It had to be the rest of the Scandians with Will and Evanlyn. He quickened his pace, and promptly paid the consequences for doing so, missing a path marker and ending chest deep in a thick mass of bottomless mud. Fortunately, he still had a firm grip on Abelard's reins, and at the word of command, the stocky horse dragged him clear of the danger. It was another good reason to continue leading the horse behind him, he realized. He backtracked to the path, found his bearings, and set out again. In spite of his seething impatience, he forced himself to go carefully. The marks left by the party in front of him were becoming more and more recent. He knew he was catching them. The question was whether he would catch them in time. Mosquitoes and marsh flies hummed and whined about him. Without a breath of breeze, it was stiflingly hot in the marshes, and he was sweating freely. His clothes were soaked and sodden with stinking mud, and he had lost one boot as Abelard had hauled him out of the quicksand. Nevertheless, he limped on, coming closer and closer to his quarry with every sudden step. At the same time, he knew he was coming closer and closer to the end of the fenlands, and that meant the beach where the Scandian ship lay to anchor. He had to find Will before the Scandians reached the beach. Once Will was on one of the wolf ships, he would be gone forever, taking back across the storm-white sea to the cold, snowbound land of the Scandians, where he would be sold as a slave to lead a life of drudgery and unending labor. Now about the rotting smell of the marshes, he caught the fresh scent of the salt air. The sea! He redoubled his efforts, throwing caution to the wind as he changed everything to catch up with the Scandians before they reached the water. The grass was thinning in front of him now, and the ground beneath his feet became firmer with every step. He was running, the horse trotting behind him, and he burst clear into the windswept length of the beach. Small ridges in the dunes in front of him blocked the sea from sight, and he swung up into Abelard's saddle on the run and set the horse to a gallop. They swept over the ridge, the ranger leaning forward low on his horse neck, urging him to greater speed. There was a wolf ship anchored offshore. At the water's edge, a group of people were boarding a small boat, and even at this distance, Halt recognized a small figure in the middle as his apprentice. "Will!" he shouted, but the sea wind snatched the words away. With hands and knees, he urged Abelard onward. It was the drumming of hoofs that alerted them. Erog, waist deep in water as he and Horace shoved the boat into deeper water, looked over his shoulder and saw the green-grey clad figure on the shaggy horse. "Hergel's beard!" he shouted. "Get moving!" Will, seated beside Evanlyn in the center of the boat, turned as Erog spoke and saw Halt barely 200 meters away. He stood precariously trying to keep his balance in the heaving boat. "Halt!" he yelled, and instantly Swengel's backhanded blow sent him sprawling into the bottom of the little craft. "Stay down!" he ordered as Erog and Horace vaulted into the boat, and the rowers sent it surging into the first line of waves. The wind, which had stopped them from hearing Halt's cry, carried the boy's thin shout to Halt's ears. Abelard heard it too, and found new speed, his muscle gathering underneath him and sending him along in a huge bound. Halt was riding without reins now, as he unslung the longbow and laid an arrow on the string. At a full gallop, he sighted and released. The bow oarsman gave a grunt of surprise and lurched sideways over the gunwale of the boat as Halt's heavy arrow slammed into him, transfixing his upper arm. The boat began to carab sideways, and Erog dashed forward, shoved the man aside, and took over the oar. "Pull like hell," he ordered them. "If he gets to close range, we're all dead men." Now Halt guided Abelard with his knees, swinging the horse into the sea itself, and thrusting forward to try to catch the boat. He fired again, but the range was extreme, and the target was heaving and tossing on the waves. Adding to that was the fact that Halt couldn't shoot near the center of the boat for fear of hitting Will or Evanlyn. His best chance was to get close enough for easy shooting and pick off the oarsmen one at a time. He fired again. The arrow bit deep into the timbers of the boat, barely an inch from Horace's hand in the stern. He jerked his hand away as if he'd been burned. "Gorlock's teeth!" he yelped in surprise, then flinched as a third arrow hissed into the water behind the boat, not a foot away. But now the boat was gaining, as Abelard, breast deep in the waves, could no longer maintain his speed. The little horse thrust valiantly against the water, but the boat was soaring alongside the wolf ship and was now over 100 meters away. Halt urged the horse a few meters closer, then stopped, defeated as he saw the figure being hauled off from the boat. The two smallest passengers were dragged towards the stern steering position. The Scandian crew lined the sides of the ship, standing on the rail to shout their defiance at the small figure who was almost obscured by the rolling grey waves. On the wolf ship, Erog yelled at them, diving for cover behind the solid bulwark. "Get down, you fools! That's a ranger! He'd seen Halt's bow coming up, then saw his hand move at incredible speed. His remaining 9 arrows were arcing high in the air before the first one struck. Within the space of 2 seconds, 3 of the Scandians lining the rail went down under the arrow storm. 2 of them lay groaning in pain. The other was ominously still. The rest of the crew flung themselves flat on the deck as arrows hissed and thudded around them. Cautiously, Eric raised his head above the bulwark, making sure that Halt was out of arrows. "Get under way," he ordered, and took the steering oar. Will, temporarily forgotten, moved to the rail. It was less than 200 meters and nobody was watching him. He could swim that far, he knew, and he began to reach for the railing. Then he hesitated, thinking of Evanlyn. He knew he couldn't abandon her. Even as he had thought, Horace's big hand closed over the collar of his jacket, and the chance was gone. As the ship began to gather away, Will stared at the mounted figure in the surf behind, buffeted by the waves. Halt was so near, and yet now so impossibly out of reach. His eyes stung with tears, and faintly he heard Halt's voice. "Will, stay alive! Don't give up! I'll find you wherever they take you!" Choking on tears, the boy raised his arm in farewell to his friend and mentor. "Halt!" he croaked, but he knew the ranger would never hear him. He heard the voice again, carrying over the sound of the sea. "I'll find you, Will!" Then the wind filled the big square sail of the wolf ship, and she heeled away from the shore, moving faster and faster towards northeast. For a long time after she had dropped below the horizon, the sudden figure sat there, his horse chest deep in the rolling wave, staring after the ship, and his lips still moved in a silent promise only he could hear.